Myths are stories that have become cultural truths, tales so ingrained in our collective consciousness that we often accept them as real. But when it comes to history, these myths can lead us far astray. From ancient epics to modern fairy tales, many of the stories we've heard about the past simply aren't true. They're distortions, lies, or dramatic embellishments that have little basis in fact. Yet we continue to repeat them, perpetuating a cycle of misinformation and misunderstanding. Now, it's important to note that myths aren't always created with malicious intent. They often serve a purpose, a way to teach lessons, preserve cultural values, or make sense of the world around us. But that doesn't make them any less harmful. When we mistake myths for history, we rob ourselves of a deeper understanding of the past. We paint simplistic narratives where there was complexity, and we ignore the nuances that make history so fascinating. Consider, for example, the myth of Sisyphus, the king of Corinth who cheated death only to be punished by being trapped forever under a stone. This myth, which originated in ancient Greece, has become synonymous with futility and the punishment of hubris. But, as a historical account, it's completely fabricated. There's no evidence that Sisyphus ever existed, let alone that he engaged in such a foolish stunt. Rather, the story served an important religious function. It warned the Greeks about the dangers of challenging the gods and reminded them of their own mortality. Similarly, the myth of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table captures the English imagination like few others. Tales of Camelot, the Holy Grail, and the sword Excalibur have inspired countless books, movies, and TV shows. But the historical Arthur is a shadowy figure at best. Most scholars agree that there was probably a British leader named Arthur who fought against the Saxons in the 5th or 6th century. But the stories of his knights, his wizard mentor Merlin, and his magical sword are almost certainly a later invention designed to create a legendary hero around this historical core. Even well-known historical figures are often the subjects of myths. Take George Washington, the first president of the United States. As children, many of us learned the story of how he chopped down his father's prized cherry tree and then confessed to the crime when confronted. But this famous anecdote was invented by Mason Locke Weems, one of Washington's biographers, more than 100 years after the alleged incident. Weems concocted the tale to portray Washington as an honest and virtuous leader, a myth that continues to endure despite its obvious historical inaccuracy. But why do these myths persist? Why do we continue to believe in stories that we know, or should know, are false? One reason is that myths are often more interesting than history. They simplify complex events and characters, making them easier to understand and remember. For example, the myth of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, neatly explains the origins of the city and its most important institutions. According to the story, Romulus killed Remus after the two disagreed on where to build the city walls, and in doing so, he established the Roman Empire. This myth, like so many others, serves as a kind of origin story, giving a clear beginning to a long and complicated history. Another reason we cling to these myths is that they reinforce our cultural values and beliefs. The story of Cinderella, for example, teaches us that kindness and hard work will ultimately be rewarded, and the myth of the Pied Piper of Hamelin reminds us of the consequences of breaking a bargain. These lessons can be powerful and comforting, especially when times are tough, but the danger comes when we mistake these myths for history, when we lose sight of the difference between fiction and reality. This can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and misrepresentations. For example, the myth of the Trojan Horse, one of the most famous legends in Western literature, tells of how the Greeks infiltrated the city of Troy by hiding in a giant wooden horse. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that the story is nothing more than a fanciful tale. Excavations at the site of ancient Troy have failed to turn up any evidence of a massive horse, and many scholars now believe that the story was invented by the Romans to glorify their victory over Troy. The problem with this myth is not just that it's inaccurate, but that it distorts our understanding of the Trojan War. The war, which took place around 1200 BC, was a brutal and bloody conflict that resulted in the destruction of two great cities. But the myth of the Trojan Horse overshadows this reality, turning the war into a battle between good and evil and reducing the Trojans to helpless victims. So how can we avoid this trap? How can we distinguish between myth and history? The answer, of course, is to keep learning, to read widely, to question what we hear, and to remember that the past is never as simple as it seems. Only then can we hope to uncover the truth and appreciate the richness and complexity of history. If you found this topic interesting, consider watching another episode about the fall of the Roman Empire, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Thanks for watching.